Hello and welcome back to On the Soul's Terms podcast. Thanks a lot for joining me today. My name is Chris Skidmore, and today we'll be looking into the archetype of the sun in the astrological chart, in astrological understanding. To get myself into the right mode for exploring the sun, a couple of weeks ago I went out, I took advantage of being here in Greece, and I went out to a temple in Arcadia, which is in the Peloponnese, in the mainland here in Greece. And I went to the temple of Basai, which is the temple dedicated to Apollo Epicurus. And of course, I went to Apollo's temple because it's Apollo who is associated with the sun, or of light, the god of light, the luminary. And so I went to see if I could, rather than just rely on the stories and everything that I've heard and everything that I read about Apollo, and piecing together all these fragments of that particular god and understanding him through multiple different angles, including, of course, Nietzsche's take on Apollonian consciousness and all of those different things that can get one into the myriad of ideas and concepts. I thought I would go to a place and see if I could sense the god himself, sense the energy, I suppose, the energy that we may connect with spirit or yang, or of course the sun itself and light and life force. It's a beautiful site. It's dedicated to Apollo Epicurus, who's known as the helper or the healer, and it was built to commemorate Apollo's help during a plague in the ancient world. The actual site itself is sitting underneath a tent, a big canopy that is over it, which essentially protects us from the wind and the elements up there because it's quite high up in the hills of Arcadia. But interestingly enough, also protects it, or perhaps blocks it, from the sun itself. And the tent there was put up in 1987, and there's a plaque that was probably put up just over 10 years later, saying that there's discussions of how and when to take the tent down. And now 40 years later, almost, the tent is still up. So it's an interesting image in itself, this temple to the sun god, up high, maybe to receive the rays of light from the sun, but unable to do so because of other conditions around it, and so covered. But it did give the opportunity to walk into that tent and then to sit by these incredible pillars that are up here. It's quite a beautiful sight. And just sit and be in silence and see if I could connect to this image of the sun, and maybe connect through that image into the sun in astrology, the sun in the horoscope generally, the sun in my horoscope. And what I found, interestingly, was a real sense of quietude. I hadn't really anticipated that, a real sense of peace and steadiness. It was as though I was maybe looking for images that might give me something to do with this god, but in the end it just came down to a very still point inside of myself. And the experience reminded me of my learnings and my studies in biodynamic craniosacral therapy. And inside of that therapeutic model, part of it is to kind of, like this tent is like a protection from all the wind, from all the mind, from all the headiness. And inside of that, within the field of craniosacral, there's sort of this waiting process for all of that fluttering mind activity to sort of just do what it's got to do. It's like you don't try to stop it, you don't do anything about it, you just acknowledge that it's there and wait. And then eventually that windiness, it just does everything that it wanted to do. And then there's a settling down and a dropping into the system. And in the language of craniosacral therapy, we're looking for the inner physician and getting in touch with that inner physician who can do a lot from the inside, can do a lot of healing work from the inside. But part of that inner physician, which obviously also relates to Apollo, as we'll get to, is to connect to what they call primary respiration, which is connecting back to the first breath It's like connecting back perhaps to our birth, and perhaps just that field of potential deep inside of ourselves that I would associate, especially since this visit, I would associate that with the sun or the interior sun, like a field of potent energy always available and always there. Now, we may not get in touch with that, and we may spend a lifetime not getting in touch with that, but the field is there all the time. And I think that's why the sun also relates to both the heart and the heart of the matter, and also the solar plexus. And these are two areas within the body and the chakra system that I feel the sun connects to and relates to. So, in a way, this space where the temple was hidden by this tent was really an incredible place to just get in touch with that and wonder if that part of Apollo and Apollo's nature is quite an important thing when we're trying to understand the sun in astrology, because the glyph itself, now if we think about this glyph for the sun, and those of you that know your astrology will already know this glyph, but let's just say it's like a target where you've got a dot in the middle, a point in the middle, and then a perfect circle around that point, and a lot of space in between. So imagine the image of a Target, or even that brand that we all know called Target. They actually have this symbol as their logo. So imagine that symbol and just stare at that for a little while. You may, if you have pen and paper here, draw it for yourself and just stare at that symbol. And this is actually a great way to come down to the very essence of astrological language, is to just sit with and be with the symbols themselves and let them speak. The same can go with the glyphs that we use, and also the signs are very good for that, even the angles. And if you just draw it and stare at it and contemplate it and be with it, or even if you like move like it, I'm not exactly sure how to move like that symbol, but I'll leave that one to you. But it's that dot in the middle that is something like the essential sun. And then the circle around it is like the sun's rays that go in 360 degrees, all possible directions, all possible tangents can come off of that. And it's interesting because the word radius is what we use to describe those lines that connect from the center to the circumference, from the center of the circle to the exterior, is a radius, which is like a ray of light, or radiant also is within that word. So these connections from that interior place to the exterior place is really what the sun, I believe, is really ultimately about. And then I really started to think about my time in primary school a little while ago now, and we had the tool, the protractor. Do you guys remember the protractor? You kind of had this pointy part, and you get your pencil in there and you put the pointy part down in the middle, and then you draw a perfect circle with your pencil using this tool, this instrument for drawing a perfect circle. So I was like, wow, a protractor is so very Apollonian. And then I started to look into like, what is this word protractor? And it turns out that one of the uses for protractor in the Middle Ages was to summon somebody for court. So essentially to summon somebody into the public, or to bring them into accountability, which is again another very solar principle here, to bring them into the light, or to bring things to light. And really, without bringing things to light, it's very difficult on a personal level and a societal level to make real and meaningful change. If we haven't made that connection to like, there's material here for me, there might be shadow, there might be pieces that I've got to work on. If we can't bring it out, if we can't summons it, I like this word, to summons it, then we can't bring it out to the light of day. And in which case it remains hidden and remains in the realm of the hidden world. And from there it may sabotage us, or it may cause us trouble. So the sun is really something quite essential to connecting with the truth at the heart of things. And I think part of it is really to shed light on things, to summons things forward, to protract, to bring these things forward. But also it's that dot in the middle that I think the sun is really asking us to connect to. But not only that, because there's also the circle around it. So all of these different expressions also are part of the sun. So yes, in the consensus reality, so let's just have a look at the understanding of what does the sun mean. Let's get some basics down. In the world of astrology, the consensus is essentially that it's your core identity. The core identity, though, not the mask that we wear, but the core. But also it's the ego. So the ego, to use Jung's sense of the ego here, the ego is the golden path to the self, the strengthening of that interior that can take us towards the self. But the ego itself is maybe some of these rays that can bring us back to the self, strengthening that ego, which is maybe in the vernacular of psychology. We think, well, no, we don't want people to be egoic, because that could be a real problem if everybody's just out for themselves. And of course, that is the shadow side of the solar. But when the sun is behaving in that way, when it's not in relationship, it's usually to do with not having a self and then just investing in many personas and masks. So then ego, which is a Greek word actually, ego, it just means me, it means I, is what we're investing in when it comes to the sun. We also think of it as a vital life force, as I said, the life force that we can tap from. There's the sun external and the sun internal. Now, there's a few signs that it's related to. It's the ruler of Leo. It's exalted in Aries, the ram. So its ruler is Leo, the lion. It's exalted in Aries, the ram. So the exalted, it means like it does well there. I'm picturing in my mind here, because I can't help it, but Odysseus, when he makes his way out of the cave, he gets underneath this big ram. In order for him to come from the cave out into the light, he has to ride a ram, which is very much an image of it being exalted in Aries. And of course, Odysseus will continue to pop into my mind because it's in the world right now on the big screens. Now, it's also in detriment in Aquarius, and this is to say, when the self has to contend with everybody else and all these other opinions and all these other ways, that it's in detriment, which just means it has to challenge itself in that place. And the other place it has to challenge itself is inside of Libra, because Libra is so relational and trying to relate to the other. So in Aquarius and Libra are places where it's not to say, oh, the sun is bad there or it doesn't work there. Actually, it works well. It just has to come across, come upon the needs of the community, for instance, like the sun coming up in the needs of the community in Aquarius and the needs of the other in Libra. So these are forces that almost like galvanize the sun, actually, rather than it being good, bad. As you would know, I'm not thinking in terms of good, bad with my astrology. I'm thinking in terms of maybe ease and challenge would be one way to think of it. The other one is that it's in its joy, and if you listen to the house series, you would know that it's in its joy in the ninth house. So you can imagine up there at the top of the chart, it would be in its joy and able to really express in that place. So it also the sun relates to authority figures, including the father. It's the king archetype. It's in the realm of self-expression. It relates to consciousness and purpose and individuation, self-assertion. It's got that core identity, which is opposed to the moon, which is more like the intrinsic nature or the emotional nature, and as opposed to the rising or the ascendant, which is more the outward presentation. So those are the simple elements of it. In medical astrology, it's related to the heart. It's got that vitality, and the metal it's related to is gold. Many a Jungian astrologer has spent a lot of time on the hero's journey with it, which is essentially to think of the process of becoming who you are. Now, within this podcast, we're not going to necessarily think that that's a hero's journey, but the journey of discovering gold and sharing gold. Let's put it that way, discovering and then sharing the gold that we all are born with. So now we're just taking a few bits and pieces from the world of science that really offers its own form of mythos when it comes to our solar system, and especially for our own star, the sun. So firstly, the maths The mass of the sun is 99.86% of the total mass of the solar system. So that's 333,000 Earth masses, 333,000 times of Earth masses in there. In fact, Jupiter, our Zeus, is almost all of the remaining 0.14%, and Earth is just a tiny, tiny fraction of that, something like 0.0003% of the mass. So that gives you sort of this perspective of size and of just how enormous this ball of light is. In fact, 1.3 million Earths could fit inside of the sun by volume. It has another really interesting mythic layer where the core is around 15 million degrees Celsius. All my degrees will be in Celsius. So that's where the engine room is. That's the highest heat. We can get a sort of alchemical fusion engine image there as the hydrogen is becoming helium. And then out at the surface, it's much, much less, although extremely hot still, 5,500 degrees. And then there's a gap before the corona, and the corona is like the crown, like the halo. And that is about 1 to 2 million degrees. So for some reason, it goes very, very hot in the core. That's to be expected. It gets cooler out on the edge, but then out at the corona, it's actually about 500 times hotter than the surface that's just beneath it. And this is something that astrophysicists have no idea why that is. It shouldn't be like that, but it's just this anomaly. It's fascinating to think of this corona or crown and the heat of that. It's almost like the crown itself contains so much archetypal power, more than perhaps many of our surfaces can hold. Something to think about with the sun when we think about the archetype that we take on and how to also have the ability to take that crown off and just remain in that cool surface layer sometimes. Perhaps remembering always to stay close to our mortal self when we take on these immortal energies. And then there was something very fun that I discovered, and it's the journey of the photon. So the actual journey of the photon when it goes from the surface of the sun to the earth takes 8 minutes and 20 seconds around about to cross 150 million kilometers. So it bursts through there. But then all of the rays of the sun that we receive here on earth are in the past, just 8 minutes in the past. But then the actual journey that a photon takes from the core to the surface, it can take somewhere between 10,000 and 170,000 years. So that's a very big variance. To escape the interior via some random movements going multiple different directions, being thrown off course, being turned around, to eventually make it out. And then once it makes it out, it then finally makes it off of the surface and takes just 8 minutes to become visible to us. So that's an interesting image of the sun. Millennia of being trapped inside this ball, then finally making it out and dashing across in a flash of light. There's a bit of a foreshadowing here of Apollo's journey as his mother Leto is in labor with him for a very long time. Artemis has already birthed, his sister has already birthed, but then it takes a very long time. The mythic number 9, 9 days and nights, it takes this much time for Apollo to be birthed, and we can hear an echo of that inside our sun science mythology of a photon taking such a long time in the combustion to get birthed. Apollo also takes a long time, 9 being a mythic number of a sort of entire cycle has to go through to get to 9. So that's the more scientific and the astrological. But what I'd really want to get to now is our own personal experience of it. What does it feel like? You know, I think when we take in scientific mythos, we end up almost sort of like, I mean, it's very useful to know those things. I think it's very useful, like they're very evocative images actually of all that heat, the corona. You know, those things really strike my imagination. But our own experiences of the sun here on the earth plane are not actually like that, are they? We never get to be on the surface of the sun. And I imagine that we will never ever get to that place. So rather we experience the sun from as earthlings. And think about that when the sun rises or when the sun sets, there's this real herald of color, of light, of vibrancy. It's like the sun goes over the top with its displays, almost like this peacocking of coming up out of the night world into the day, or saying goodbye and heading back into the night world. This really extravagant display. And then we think what it's like when the sun's not around in the nighttime. Maybe that sort of eases off and we've got more space for contemplation, for dreaming, for the dreaming mind, for love, for eros. And the absence of that all-seeing eye in the sky can sort of like help us to be in a more reflective mode. And then what's it like when the sun is at its very apex at the top of the sky, staring down at us? What's that like in your felt experience? Now, if you're in cold climates, that's going to be such a relief to feel that sun. And if you're in hot climates, that's going to be so antagonistic to you, because you just want to get out of the way of that as quickly as you can and shield yourself from that. So it's different experiences depending on what climate we're in, what season we're in. And all of these are relationships to the sun. So, we think of it as this steady fire, but actually it's a cycle. And it's a cycle of rising and apexing and setting. It kind of waxes and wanes per our experience, much like the moon waxes and wanes. And actually the waxing and waning of the moon isn't really the moon at all. It's the solely lunar relationship. The waxing and the waning and the phases is a relationship between sun and moon. And the light that we see on the moon obviously is borrowed light from the sun. It's reflected. And the light that we get from the sun is bright when it's around, and we definitely know about it when it's not there. And also that the sun is associated with the seasons. So we get that sense through the equinoxes and the solstices also of, the sun returning, coming to the apex in the middle of summer, disappearing or starting to disappear. We head to the solstice and it gets very, very dark. And then the sun slowly returns. That idea gives us a sense of these sun gods or these kings, sacrificial kings who would die and then get reborn. So many mythologies like this, the death of the king and then the rebirth, even up into our day, because that is essentially the Eastern mythology as well, the death of the king and then the rebirth. Essentially, that's a celebration of the sun in that rebirth moment, and a prayer to the sun that it might come back when we head into those really dark days of winter. So it's cycles upon cycles in a way in the ancient world, and I'll get to this in our mythic section. There was the idea of the great year that would go a great year in the ancient world. It seems to me from my research that it was around 9 years, but it could have been 7 or 8 or 9. But anyway, in this great year, there would be also a bigger cycle that takes in this 9. And the number 9 is going to show up again and again for us. But I think astrologically as the nodes of the moon having their 9 years before they return to their oppositional sign. So it's an 18-year cycle, but can be split into 2 sets of 9. So this idea of the great year, oftentimes that was a time at the end of the great year that there would be a forgiveness of debt and a sort of reordering and restructuring of society, a bit of a leveling out. And I feel, it's one of the many things from the ancient world I feel a longing for now, of those ways that things can actually level out rather than sort of keep building on each other without any resets built into the system. And then, of course, the 26,000-year cycle is also the precession of the equinox, and the equinoxes being related to the sun and the sun's journey. So yeah, we get that sense of an even greater cycles, and hopefully, that can also remind us of the place we're in history, and connect us to these larger cycles that are going on, and not have us sort of like chasing our tails inside of just this one perpetual moment that can be so confusing when we don't get a context for where we are inside of the day, inside of the season, inside of the year, inside of the great year, inside of the epoch. That's how we really center ourselves in knowing where we are, which isn't to say we have to gather up all that information, but to feel or to experience ourselves at the center of something. And all of these suns that are getting born, our sun signs that are getting born, we can imagine as Dane Ruja imagines, we're born with the requisite gifts for the troubles of the time at hand. We're born with the requisite gifts for the troubles of the times at hand. And I think that's also, when we meditate on our suns, that can also help us with like not getting stuck in navel gazing, not just thinking about, well, who am I and how can I be better? But who am I in the context of this world, and how can what I'm born with, the gifts I'm born with, assist and help this world to become more beautiful, more harmonic, more available, to live better, to live with each other better, to live with ourselves better. Okay, and now we're going to move into our mythic section of the podcast and join the god Apollo, just one god. But we're going to make the opposite move that Joseph Campbell made for us so many moons ago. And I'm always forever grateful to Joseph Campbell's work. But he did leave us with this kind of fixed idea of the monomyth. And I'm going to do the reverse here, where I'm going to take Apollo and give us the polymyth of Apollo, because Apollo, like all of these figures from the ancient world, have so many sides to them and so many textures. So we're going to look at Apollo because he is the sun god. We're going to have a deep dive into his story here. There are so many stories left behind about Apollo, so to give him a sense of order or of harmony, we could say, maybe a mandala of his many images, we're going to move his story through the Zodiac. And we're going to start with three signs, not at the beginning, but we're going to start with Gemini because it's a circle and we can really start where we want. And Gemini is an obvious candidate because he is a twin, and his mother and his mother's siblings are very involved in his birth story. So the first section here is going to be a sort of a blending and a merging of the stories of Apollo through Gemini, Cancer, and Leo as we come into his sibling and his mother's sibling, then his birth, which is very Cancerian, and then into his golden light that comes out as Leo, the birth of this golden child. And interestingly, these three signs, Gemini, Cancer, and Leo, are ruled by Mercury, the moon, and the sun. So it's a little bit of an interplay and a weaving between those as well. And then once we've heard that birth story, we'll move into the rest of the zodiac, highlighting other elements of the sun god and his many faces. And I wonder if each section that we're in, you'll hear parts of your own sun related to your sun sign and the house that it's in, but let's see. And for the patrons listening, we'll have the opportunity to deepen this on a more personal level on our monthly call, where we bring in each person on the call's sun and get a sense of this Apollo mythology and how it can help us to understand our own personal suns. So we're actually going to start not with Leto, because she's pregnant in this story and she's got the twins inside of her womb. But we're going to switch to her sister Asteria because I love this image and I really want to slow it down for us so we can feel this image. So Asteria, mother of Hecate, by the way, who we explored in the lunar episode, is pursued by Zeus, and she turns herself into a quail. Those little birds, those funny little birds, a quail, migratory birds. In fact, it's the mother quail who leads the migration. So she turns herself into a quail, then Zeus turns herself into this enormous eagle, but because he's too big and fast, sort of overshoots her. And then, with a bit of space, she turns herself into a stone and then drops down into the middle of the ocean. And I mean literally the middle, in the center of the Cyclopes. And the Cyclopes actually means the cycle or the circle. And then as she comes back up, she is an island. The island is known as Ortygia, which means quail, like Quail Island. But then it changes into Delos. The name Delos is essentially visible, the visible one. So the island of Delos comes up. And this is the image that I really love. We've got Asteria, who's a star, who's turned herself into a quail and then a stone and dropped deep into the ocean and then surfaced. Becomes visible, the invisible becoming visible and maybe becoming invisible again, and then remains this floating point, this floating island. And as soon as I heard this story, I thought, well, there's a really great image for the sun. It's for something more essential in the sun, not this bright golden thing that we imagine, but something very simple, the rocky crag, essentially, of Delos, that is a floating island, so not actually fixed in place, it's floating on the water, but it remains central to all of the other islands in the area, the whole Cyclades. Even today, Delos is considered to be the center of the Cyclades, and it's almost considered that the Cyclades themselves orbit around Delos just as the planets orbit around the sun. So we have some striking images already for the sun, I feel. And then we switch gears over here to Leto, and we see her journey. Hera is furious that she's pregnant with, especially what she can see is going to be quite important deities, Artemis and Apollo. And so she's furious, and she decides to tell everybody that they should not accept Leto in. And so all of these islands and all of these places Leto goes, and she's turned away. And you may recognize that. I certainly recognize that from my Bible studies as a child. She's turned away from place to place, just like Mother Mary was turned away, and eventually arrives in a very humble manger, which actually births Christ. Artemis has already been born at this point, so they're traveling together, mother and daughter, looking for a place. And Delos is very suspicious because she knows, she can sense, this is the island Delos now, like a personified island. She knows and can sense that that this is going to be a very strong and powerful god. She's worried that if she births this god, he may just kick her back down underneath the ocean and go and set up his temple somewhere else. So she has Leto swear on the river Styx that that won't happen to her and that she'll be taken care of and celebrated. And Leto does exactly this. And so a deal is made. We can see lots of the Gemini, not just the sisters, not just the twins, but this idea of like striking a deal, making sure we're setting things up right and doing, you know, the hermetic stuff, the Mercury stuff. We're not just accepting things that as they are because we know that there's tricksters out there. So she doesn't just accept. Delos shows us like, no, a deal has to be made first. And then we move into this more Cancerian scene where Leto is struggling and Hera has hidden Eileithyia, and Eileithyia is her daughter, Hera's daughter, actually the daughter of Hera and Zeus, one of only 4 that I know of, who's the goddess of childbirth. So she's hidden her behind a cloud. She can't see what's going on, a golden cloud, and she's hidden. And Leto is struggling, and Artemis is doing her best to help. But the time is going by, and they go 9 days and 9 nights, as I've mentioned a few times already in the podcast, this number 9. Also the 9 months of gestation. We also have the 9 muses associated with Apollo once he does get born here. You know, in the ancient world, they said it was 10 moons of pregnancy, and the 10th moon would be when the birth would happen. But that's only because they started counting not with the 0, but with the 1. And so it adds on this extra month there. And so then they get Iris. Her name actually means rainbow, and she's a messenger goddess. They send Iris up with a bribe, essentially, to bribe Eileithyia out of hiding this beautiful golden necklace. I believe it's 9 cubits long. And they give her that necklace. And then Eileithyia comes out of hiding, and the two of them, Eileithyia and Iris, come back as turtle doves. And as soon as Eileithyia's feet touch the island of Delos, Apollo the sun god is born. And he's born with 4 goddesses that stand by, although Hera is kind of considered to be the 5th one here. But the 4 goddesses, interestingly, are Themis, Rhea, Dione, and Amphitrite. So Themis is an ancient prophetess. So she was one of the early goddesses of Delphi, who was essentially a seer. And Dione also had the sacred oak. So the oak, the seeing and singing oak, who could also prophesize, was sacred to her. Then we have Rhea, the mother of all of the Olympians, and Amphitrite, who's the Oceanid, an ancient partner of Poseidon. We see in her mythology like an ancient sea goddess. So you've got these 4 powerful goddesses, plus Hera, who's sort of like a part of it and not a part of it. A part of it in she plays like the wicked stepmother that doesn't want it to happen. She plays the challenger of it, I suppose. And then out of that scene, Apollo is born. And as soon as he's born, there's just gold everywhere. He's born and the golden light shines forth. And I may just read here from Carl Karenyi because it's quite the scene. So just as Alethea arrived on the island Leto gave birth, she gripped with both hands the palm trees that grew there, and with both feet she kneaded the soft meadow land. The soil laughed beneath her feet, the gods sprang forth, and the goddesses cried aloud. They bathed the child clean with fair water and swaddled it in white cloth. The braided band around the swaddling clothes was of gold. Yet the mother did not suckle the child. Themis gave him nectar and ambrosia. When he had tasted the immortal food, no swaddling bands could any longer restrain him. Phoebus Apollon said to the goddesses, "Dear to me shall be the lyre and bow, and in my oracles I shall reveal to men the inexorable will of Zeus." The goddesses were amazed. Delos shone golden, and the island blossomed. Descriptions are given of how at this time the whole of Delos was fragrant, or of how swans circled singing 7 times about the island, while Leto still lay in the birth pangs, and as they circled an 8th time they no longer sang. The gods sprang forth, and the Delian nymphs sang the sacred song of Alethea. The brazen welkin echoed, and not even Hera was unaffected, for Zeus took anger away from her. The foundations of Delos turned to gold, and all day long the round pool on the island shone golden. The leaves of the olive turned to gold, for this tree was also grew on Delos, as well as the palm, and it was told of the olive too that Leto had supported herself upon it. The river Inopus overflowed with gold, and it was further told that a cock was present at the birth of the god, that fowl of which it was also stated that at moonrise it falls into ecstasy and dances, although chiefly it is a witness of sunrise. Since that time, the cock is thought to have been Leto's favourite bird. So we can see that transition from the moon to the sun here, from Cancer into Leo, and the golden light and the shining forth and the big golden celebration that happens. So that kind of gives us a glimpse of this birth of the god. It's like it's radiant, it's overflowing with imagery, it's over the top. We got the 7 circling swans. The number 7 will come up in a little bit as we go further into Apollo's story, because it is the 7 strings of the lyre. So that gives us this movement from Gemini to Cancer to Leo through his birth story. And now we're going to take this god who's just been born, so you know his birth story now, and we're going to take him through the rest of the zodiac. So the next sign is Virgo, and this is where we see Apollo as the foster father of Chiron. So Chiron is born, he's rejected by his father Saturn, or abandoned even before he's born, and then abandoned by his mother Philyra, and basically left for dead. And it's Apollo that finds him and takes him under his wing as a mentor and as a figure that can assist him to become who he is. In fact, it's quite a moving scene when Apollo finds Chiron, this healer god, this centaur. You know, he was rejected by his mother essentially because he was half horse, half boy, and she just saw him as sort of a frightening beast. So she leaves him out with the goats, or perhaps the sheep, I can't quite remember. And Apollo finds him there and sees not this wretched being, but the light underneath there. Apollo isn't just the sun, but also has the ability to see the sun and sees Chiron's healing abilities. And of course, then Chiron is out there in the wild and is able to speak to the trees and make tinctures and learns everything about the healing world from nature, but also learns from Apollo the more ordered healing world. And there's this sense of combined effort in a way between the civilized world and the natural world that goes on there. And it's said also that Artemis teaches him archery at the time. So that becomes Chiron's whole reality there. So this is the Virgo section. Then we move from Virgo up into Libra. And as I said, that number 7, the swans circling 7 times. I think about Libra and harmonics here. I think about Libra and the 7 strings of the lyre. and the sense that it's through Libra we can come into that cosmic harmony. These seven strings are also the seven spheres or the seven heavenly bodies. And Apollo in Libra becomes this tuner of the world lyre, the one able to play the tune. If we look inside of ourselves, it could be this sun that can play all seven of those notes in harmony, which is to say, can connect us through our seven main planets, the sun, the moon, and then Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And that can be played from the Earth, which of course is ultimately the octave, the eighth, is the Earth itself that sits right at the heart of our experience. And so sitting upon the Earth, playing the lyre, this is where Apollo does his best Libran work. But there's a little side quest to go on this part of the journey, and that's this other side of Libra where Apollo has a few unrequited love moments. One is with a girl and one's with a boy. The girl is called Daphne, and Daphne just means laurel or the laurel tree. And so it's a fun little side story here where he gets involved in an argument with Eros, and he's laughing at Eros's arrows, like, what are you going to do with those little things? And Eros says, well, actually, my arrows are much more powerful than yours. And Eros feels a little bit dejected by being laughed at in such a way. So he shows Apollo exactly how powerful they are, fires a golden arrow into Apollo and a lead arrow into Daphne. And the lead arrow is that of indifference, whilst the golden arrow is that of love. So then he chases Daphne, who's indifferent to him, love and indifference, these opposites, until eventually Daphne is changed into a laurel. And so Apollo is not able to meet that love, and then creates the aesthetic of the laurel. He gives to the champions, the Olympians, or those or the actors, or in the theatre, those who've shown high levels of their personal gold. He gives the laurel over, so the laurel, in a sense, becomes this symbol of love and desire and unrequited love, but then the celebration of that golden achievement. And the other story is similar in tone in a way. Hyacinthus is a youth that Apollo had fallen in love with, and they got into a discus competition, and Apollo, rather than just like play human level, played God level and flung his discus way up into the sky. And then Hyacinthus is looking for it. And then as it came down, it had so much speed, almost like a meteor, and hits Hyacinthus in the face. And so he loses face. He actually loses life. And Apollo feels so horrible and terrible about this. But then Hyacinthus becomes this plant, which is interesting that there's this return through the stories back to the plant world. It's almost like the height of the human or the height of the civilized always is coming back to the plant. And Hyacinthus, or the plant, the hyacinth, becomes a celebration of love, even though it is also of tragedy. And so we move into the realm of Scorpio, where we have a meeting with that chthonic deity, that monstrous being, in this story known as the Python. It's one of the first things that Apollo does. Actually, you can sort of sense him as a youth or a child even, and he heads straight to Delphi to confront this figure. And that's very Scorpionic imagery, as we have to somehow have a confrontation with the underworld. And in a way, it becomes this image of a battle between light and dark. Apollo being the god of light and sun, and the Python representing this dark deity of the underworld. And so it's interesting because in some images that we see, the Python ends up being like a guardian of the omphalos, which is the central point of the world, essentially, up at Delphi there. And so the Python and Apollo seem to have some kind of a relationship or a partnership between God and underworld monster, where we're helping each other out. But the more famous story is that he comes with his arrows. So he brings in that Sagittarius, which will be the next image, of course. He comes with his arrows and kills the Python with his arrows, which obviously has a bit of a ringing down the ages of all these different dragons that have been faced including St. George and the Dragon classically in English mythology. So we can hear this image, and it brings up an interesting tension point, doesn't it? Because if the python is representing those dark parts of the consciousness, like our own demons, like maybe addictive processes and things that are going to drag us down or engulf us or swallow us whole, like pythons do, and digest us and take us through that, then obviously it needs a fierce and like Mars-like confrontation. And yet, if that deity, the python, is more the seer, the python then becomes the pythia. So if that's the part of us that is able to see in the dark, able to connect, like this other eye, the lunar eye in a way, then the last thing we would want to do is fire arrows at it. So we'd have to create some kind of a connection with it. And so we're left with a sort of ambiguous opening image in a sense, because on the one hand, the guarding of the omphalos, that becomes the ally, and on the other hand, the death of the python. And in fact, in that story, there's a rotting because the sun comes down and rots the corpse. The word pytho essentially meaning to rot in that version of the story. So we have this connection, but either way, it's taking us through the underworld part of the journey in Scorpio, and then into Sagittarius, and into Sagittarius we enter Delphi itself. With Sagittarius, it is that vision, that visionary place, the top of the mountain and the view from up there. In fact, Delphi, it's said, was found by sending 2 eagles off to fly all around the world, and they go through this big figure 8. And they land here at the omphalos, which is the center of the world that I just mentioned there. So it's those eagles and that eagle eye view and that prophetic vision and the visionary that ends up being the Pythia, who has access to oracular knowing, who has access to sort of next level knowing. We could also hear from Dione being a part of that she was connected, a part of his birth story, connected to the sacred oak, the oak that is also a prophet and a seer. You can imagine sort of a participation with the oak tree and the talking to that natural element of the oak and listening for the rustling of the leaves and the birds and the different things that happen, or even perhaps just having the sense of communication and conversation with the oak. So that takes us up there, and then when we go into Capricorn, we can get into Apollo's maxims at Delphi, which the main 2, or the most famous of them, is know thyself and nothing in excess. Know thyself and nothing in excess, almost like helping us with those 2 parts of the sun, because within that glyph we have that limit, right? We have the dot in the middle and then a circle around it, which represents that limit. And to know thyself is also to know one's limits, to remember that we're not gods, that we're mortals, but we're participating in a place where there are gods. Know thy limits also, like know when to give back to the god, know when a god has done something for you, knowing when to sacrifice, and knowing when to give reverence to that other layer of consciousness. There's a nice side story here too, with the story of Pan and Apollo. So Pan, the goat god, and Apollo once got into a musical contest to see whose music was the most impressive. Pan went first and played his pipes and made a cacophony of sound, and all of the animals and the mountains and the trees started swaying along, came down to participate, and it was a big raucous event of sound. And then when it was Apollo's turn, he played the lyre, and everything went into stillness and silence. And I love this story because it's the 2 sides of Capricorn, really. It's the silence and the stillness and the steadiness of Capricorn, but also the cacophony of expressiveness and wildness. Both of those are within that sign, the Apollonian and the Pan. And this does get judged, though. So we go into that side of Capricorn, and the judgment is by none other than a mountain spirit called Tmolus. And Tmolus judges that Apollo's music is better, which, we can agree or disagree. Midas decided to disagree, and for his disagreement, Apollo gave him donkey ears. So that's the other side of Apollo as well. He tends to get a bit upset if he's not winning. There can be a side of Apollo, and maybe a side of all of our suns and all of our Leonine consciousnesses that can be upset if we're not recognized as the best. So then into Aquarius we go, and Aquarius, as we know, is these two rivers. And in the story of Orestes, which is a story of essentially like a blood debt that was going on and on and on, there's a setting up of a court system, the first mythic setting up of a judicial system. And once the court ruling had been heard, Orestes is sent to be cleansed by Apollo, to be cleansed of his sins, essentially, so that he can then rejoin society. So I think of that cleansing process, that resetting, as the two rivers. Now in the story, it's with blood, with pig's blood, that is ritualized and cleansed. But we may imagine also those rivers or the golden streams or whatever it might be, that once things have gone through due process, there is a chance of redemption and there is a chance of joining. And that also allows him to rejoin the community. So the sense of the Aquarian civilizing function here coming through, the cleanse, the reset, and the rejoining community. And so then we move on to Pisces. There's a really nice side story here of Apollo becoming a dolphin and jumping onto a pirate ship full of Cretans, disguising himself there and ultimately bringing them in to be priests at the Delphic oracle. That's just one side story here. But the main story of Pisces really brings us to the god Asclepius, who's a son of Apollo, who becomes the healing god and is fostered by Chiron. And Chiron teaches him all of the Virgo and stuff over the other side of the medicine of Virgo and Pisces. And then Asclepius takes all of that in and then takes it one step further to bring in the psyche itself, to bring in dreams and dreaming, because he sees that so much can be done with herbs and hands, chiropractics, and all these forms of medicine that Chiron practices with his tinctures and his work with his hands is so effective. But also some things just keep coming back. And so Asclepius works with the psyche itself, enters the dreaming through ritual in order to perform deeper levels of medicine. That Asclepian tradition is the tradition that is the roots of our modern medicine, and that's something I've talked about in different places. It's obviously a pet subject of mine, so you'll be able to find other places where I've talked about that story. But that's also Apollo, given that it's the son of Apollo. In that story, however, we do get the sense of Coronis. So we have the Corona, now we have the Coronis, who's the mother of Asclepius, who's sort of another one of these lost mothers that takes us back to Thessaly and takes us back to the ancient ways of feminine-based medicine that is like this moment in history where this becomes superseded by the more masculine styles of medicine, or the more Apollonian styles, and the more shamanic or the more earth-based is getting pushed to the side. And we can hear that in Apollo's story. Like, if we're going to tell the story of the sun and we're going to tell the story of Apollo, of course we're going to come into contact with places where the sun takes over from the moon. But we can also hear the beautiful connection between sun and moon that's always possible here, but doesn't necessarily come to fruition. So then Asclepius ends up going into a certain overreach and bringing someone back from the dead. Hades complains to Zeus. Zeus sends a thunderbolt and Asclepius is killed. And so here we shift tone into Aries, and obviously Apollo is devastated and grief-stricken and angry at the injustice that he sees, where Zeus took it upon himself to strike him down with a thunderbolt. And this is when one of those really rare moments in myth where someone directly challenges Zeus. I mean, he can't go directly at Zeus, but instead goes to the Cyclopes that are in Tartarus down there in the underworld that are making the thunderbolts, and kills the Cyclopes. Essentially, this is the sun exalted in Aries when the wrong happens, not brooding upon it, not thinking, not getting caught in the thought patterns, and certainly not swallowing down that energy, but actually making a direct action, a direct at the perpetrator as well. So he goes straight down to kill the Cyclopses that make the thunderbolts, like directly to the power source itself. Obviously, this brings a great fury down from Zeus, who then is thinking that he's going to have to cast Apollo down to Tartarus himself and lock him up and all of that. And it's actually Leto who comes back. Rather than doing that, why not put him into a state of humility? Why not humble Apollo, where the punishment sort of fits the crime in a way? Teach him some humility. And so then we're going to move into the Taurus register here, where Apollo is sent down to serve a king, Admetus, in the mortal realm. And he himself becomes a mortal in a sense, or disguises himself as a mortal, shows up at Admetus's door and asks him what he can do. And Apollo is given the task of being a cow herder, which is a Taurian theme here. So he spends time around the cows and the bulls. As a side note here, all of those cows that he tends to have twins. So Admetus is really a follower of the laws of the land, and he follows the rule of Xenia. And Xenia is to take care of any strangers, to give them what they want, to house them, to give them shelter, to give them food, and to give them comfort, which he does, not knowing that it's Apollo, just thinking he's immortal. And Apollo is so moved by this mortal Admetus, so touched that it's like he can now get in touch with mortals and with what it is to be human. And he's so moved by it that he really wants to help Admetus out. It turns out there is something that Admetus needs, because he's fallen in love with a woman named Alcetus. But Alcetus's father is a bit of a tyrant. He's put a task out there for any suitors for his daughter, that only the suitor who can yoke a lion and a boar together in a chariot can have his daughter's hand in marriage. A lion and a boar. So it's an impossible task that essentially, as soon as the suitor's going to get near to that lion or the boar, they're going to get killed. And many a suitor has come along and been killed in that process. It's also interesting that it's a lion, which is a solar image, and the boar also has a crescent moon shaped tusk. So it's considered to be a lunar creature. So it could also be like the task of yoking the solar and lunar together on this one chariot. And maybe it is that difficult for us to get the solar and lunar working together, is that big of a task. Anyway, Apollo steps up and helps Admetus with that, because he feels such love for him, and wins him this bride. And then at the end of his year and a day, reveals that he's Apollo and basically bestows him many gifts. But it turns out when he does get this bride, they put on this big feast, but they forget. How could they forget? But they do forget to sacrifice to Artemis. So actually he has the sun god here, but he forgets to sacrifice to the moon goddess. As such, when he goes into his bridal chamber, he sees not his wife there, but a whole lot of coiled snakes. And he sees this as an omen that death is coming for him, and that Artemis isn't going to be very forgiving of his forgetfulness here. We move into the Gemini register here. Apollo comes up with a trick. So he goes to see the Fates, otherwise known as the Moirae, the three sisters. And it's all of our lives are in their hands as mortals. You know, they know the day that we're going to die. So when it comes to the day that he's going to die, Apollo comes along and gets them drunk, almost so they might forget. They might just forget to take him on that day. But in the end, what ensues is a conversation between Apollo and the Moirae, where they've already agreed to not take him, but they say, well, somebody has to come, because the registers of life and death, where we got into this trouble in the first place, when Asclepius brought someone back from the dead, the registers of life and death need to harmonize, they need to balance. And so if not Admetus, then someone else has to take his place. And that's the deal that they strike. So Apollo goes back to the family and asks around, will anybody take the place of Admetus? Talks to his parents, talks to other elders, and nobody wants to give up even a day of life. Life is just too precious for them, and nobody's willing to do that. And in a forlorn moment, when it seems like the fates are going to come and take Admetus, Alcetus, the wife, steps up and steps in to that position And we enter the Cancer realm here, the life-giving realm, the life-taking realm. And Alcestis steps in this extraordinary moment of Cancerian loyalty to her husband and steps into that role and is taken. She's sort of taken to the tomb or taken to a liminal place. And now we're going to move. We've got a moment here, sort of the womb to the tomb. But we're not going to finish here because there's a nice sort of adjunct or a postscript to the story. Because Alcestis is now sort of liminal. She's at the tomb, but she's not been taken yet to the underworld. So Admetus is in a deep grieving process. And who should come along at that time but Hercules? And Hercules has no idea of what's going on and nobody tells him. And Admetus, because he's such a great host and he respects Xenia, he respects the guest host relationship so deeply, he takes Hercules in, he gives him everything that he wants, and Hercules takes full advantage of it in full Leo style. He's drinking, he's eating, he's entertaining, he's singing, he's dancing, he's doing it all. And then somebody whispers to Hercules, hey, this is actually a place of grieving. And then he feels such shame at his behavior that he's been so over the top, even though he didn't know. And so immediately, and this is the sun in its home in Leo with this Leo 9 hero that's at the banquet here, he goes directly to the tomb. And as Thanatos, who's the death god, is coming along to take Alcestis down to the underworld, he stops him in his tracks and he wrestles him. And he wrestles him for the life of Alcestis. And of course, being Hercules, he wins this wrestle with the great god Thanatos. He wrestles death and he wins the battle. He wins her back. To bring her back, he puts a veil over her eyes. And Admetus can't even really look at her. He's so grief-stricken. And eventually the curiosity comes and he lifts the veil on Alcestis and sees it's his wife. Admetus and Alcestis are together again. But this moment, it sort of mirrors back to our original moment of the lifting of the veil. It's Delos itself, the visible one who comes from the invisible. Or it's even that moment at the very beginning of the tent over the temple of Apollo Epicurus in Basai. The tent that's over there that is still covered and not lifted yet, maybe because us humans, we're not ready yet for the kind of harmonizing that Apollo could bring to us, especially if we could yoke the lion and the boar, if we could have Apollo and Artemis harmonizing with each other. The lifting of the veil and the coming back into right relationship is right there at the end of our story of the sun. Well, that was a big journey, so thank you very much for joining me and for going on the whole expedition with me through the signs. And I hope that somewhere in there you've heard something about your own sun and you can take something from that or learn of the suns of the other people that you know. The sun is a sign that we tend to know about someone. When someone asks what's your sign, they still tend to mean what's your sun sign. And it's the easiest to know because we just have to know when a person is born. We just need to know their birthday to know it. So it's one that I hope that can help you to listen in to your own sun, to feel what it might be about, to see the suns in others, and perhaps help you to understand the sun from a more mythic angle, or from the sun, as I said, it can be kind of flattened, it can be a two-dimensional thing, and hopefully this has added some dimensionality, some myths, some stories, some images to help us resound a little better with that note from the lyre that is the sun, the sound of the soul that is in every human being. Our little piece of the divine, our little piece of our soul star. Thanks for joining me, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.